Few of the wooden vessels from the Aegis sail have attained as romantic a standing as the frigate. Full rigged and built for speed, she truly embodies the spirit of adventure so emblematic of the period, rivaled only in charm by the preceding galleon. However, this image belies the convoluted history of the frigate, which contradicts our 21st century need to classify vessels into neat and tidy categories. Up until the 1850s, classifying a ship or boat was difficult, and it became more convoluted the further back you went. Different seamen might call a vessel by different categories. A frigate could also be a pinnace, and a frigate could also be a bark, or be converted into a bark, and a frigate could not only be a frigate, but a snow-rigged frigate. A part of the reason was because whilst sailors post-1850 would define their ships purely by their rigging, earlier seamen defined them both by the rigging and the shape of their hull. This was further complicated by ships primarily being constructed by the rule of thumb, and tradition passed on from father to son, with many vessels having local quirks that only experienced seamen could notice and point out. The mystery of the 17th century frigate is further exacerbated by the lack of illustrations and ship plans, especially in the early periods and the fringes of the Atlantic. It is only in the late 17th and early 18th centuries that models and plans of frigates became more abundant. Defining the 17th century frigate is difficult. In one sense it was a ship type, in another sense it was a category, and in another it was a style, a trend of constructing ships to be faster. Faster than what? As we shall see, as we shall see, as we shall see. That is a question somewhat left to interpretation, as we search for some manner of truth in the mysterious history of the iconic frigate. From the foggy waters of Renaissance Flanders to the raging seas of revolution. Students of ships and the sea have come to agree that the first of frigates stemmed from the Mare Magnum, the Mediterranean. From the ancients to the Renaissance, this turbulent tub was fought over between galleys, long and flat vessels carrying one or two masts but propelled primarily by a massive gang of oarsmen. Embodying a vast category of vessels, from the great lanterna to the humble galeotta, frigate denoted the smallest sort, used as a dispatch or tender to bigger boats, that is, delivering messages or carrying supplies. A long shot from its prestigious descendants, it nonetheless embodied the iconic quality of speed, not to mention the likelihood of being built long and slim, facilitating the use of oars. At some point in the late 16th century, a different type of frigate had appeared in Spanish America, known to them as the fregata. This meant neither a galley nor a warship, but a small or medium-sized trader, often built locally and used for coastal trade. On occasion, it could make transatlantic passages. Its relation to other frigates, earlier and later, is not entirely certain. The Spanish naturally took their Old World vessels with them to the colonies, such as the Bergantin and the Galeotta, the former of whom was quite radically improved from its Mediterranean counterpart, but the fregata seems to have been even more modified. When English documents of this period spoke of frigates, it was primarily in reference to this boat, encountered by sea dogs the likes of Hawkins and Drake. Some of these frigates were captured and converted into pinnaces. Since the colonial fregata seems to have primarily been sail-powered, whereas the Elizabethan pinnace was oar-powered, this most likely meant that the captured fregatas had oars added to them, possibly with the cutting of superstructures or decks. There is at least one naval document from the reign of Elizabeth mentioning frigates as a vessel type in the Elizabethan navy, but the features of it remain diffuse. A prize ship was called the French frigate, but no other navy ships were classified as such. This implies that a frigate either had some other more common designation, or that it was a very small vessel. Frigates do appear in other English documents. The word is used both to describe the 8-ton Squirrel and a 200-ton Galizavra of the Spanish treasure fleet. The Squirrel must have been akin to a pinnace or colonial fregata, whereas a Galizavra was a galley-like vessel, oared and built with a shallow draft, but with a continuous deck and anti-boarding netting. Propelled by 14 oars in addition to their sails, they usually carried 16 broadside guns and 2 chasers in the bow and stern each. And some of them partook in the Spanish Armada. Some of them looked more like galleys, whereas others looked like small galleons, with both appearing like obvious ancestors of the frigate we know and love. Europe in the early modern age was a place chiefly divided by religion, a fiery dispute between Catholics and the new Reformists. The battle lines were the most clear in the Low Countries, pitting the Calvinist Netherlands against Catholic Flanders, an isolated province of Spain. Likewise involved were the Anglican English and the French Huguenots. And of notice that this religious conflict was primarily fought at sea between pirates, merchants, and pirate hunters. The Reformers had long carried the edge in the 16th century, but at the turn into the 17th, they began to be overtaken by Flemish corsairs from Dunkirk. These rampant plunderers operated a brand new category of vessels, collectively known as frigates. The Spanish Low Countries saw the dawn of their privateering age in the 1590s, when multiple projects were launched to harass the English coast and Dutch fishing fleet. One of the most successful was launched by 28-year-old Federico Spinola, a Genoan commanding a fleet of galleys. Among them was the Mediterranean frigate, propelled by a bank of 10 oars and filled with musketeers, used to astounding effect in the shallow waters of the Low Countries. The vessel made such an impression on the Flemish that they decided to take the frigate and improve it. The size was beefed up, allowing for the addition of more sail and cannon, while still retaining the length and oar capacity. Another possible origin of the Dunkirk frigate is Havana, Cuba. In 1590, Juan de Porva Canavares wrote how they were building high and very strong ships, frigates drawing very little water, intended for the banks of Flanders. In the Hawkins Drake voyage, there are references to frigates or zavras, likely the aforementioned Galley-Zavra, of 200 tons and 20 guns. And now the Tsars mentions how the Dunkirkers lowered the castles of their vessels, meaning that they might have taken the Havana frigate and cut them down. Indeed, by 1610, the small frigate had been further improved into a larger variant, weighing between 150 to 200 tons, and carrying around 1 gun to every 10 tons, and 1 crewman for every 2 tons. So a 150-ton frigate would have carried about 15 guns and a crew of 75. These frigates had possibly been inspired by the larger Spanish vessels present in the region, such as the aforementioned Galley-Zavra or the Havana frigate, but also the Galleoncette. These were essentially small galleons, but constructed with lower superstructures, a sleeker hull, and facilities for rowing on the main deck. Most of our knowledge of the Flemish frigates come from vague descriptions, often made by enemies unable to catch them. They seem to have varied in design, and in 1640, an exiled bishop confused a packet boat for a frigate. Packet boats were messengers, carrying no guns, and only a crew of 7 to 8 men. Nathaniel Boteler denied them as a specific type, saying they were indistinguishable from pinnaces. No illustrations or plans have been preserved, and the construction of the frigate was a closely guarded secret that wouldn't become widespread until the 1640s. Partly because the vessel was so successful. It represents the first generation of specialized fighting ships outside of the Mediterranean. Its development can clearly be linked to the growth of the fishing industry in the North Sea, and it was developed purely to assault the fishing vessels and cargo ships of the Dutch Republic. Unlike the high castles of the galleon, the frigate had a low profile, making it difficult to detect, especially in the misty conditions so prevalent in the region. Most notable was the speed. In 1626, the Duke of Buckingham complained to Parliament of the Flemish depredations, deeming their frigates as fit for flight as for fight. Even the fastest of English vessels just couldn't catch them. When the wind died, the frigates could either escape or pursue by rowing. But with a good wind, their long, sleek and aquadynamic hull gave them a steady advantage, cutting through the sea like a dagger. In light winds, on the other hand, the Flemish utilized a new invention called stunsails. These were sails mounted on booms extending out of the regular spars, allowing the Flemish to catch every huff of wind before closing into gun range. Flemish gunners earned a fearsome reputation. Another credit to the speed of the frigates was their light build. On the flip side, it severely reduced their lifespan to between 5 to 20 years, whereas a regular European ship could last into their 50s. This made them even more elusive, in addition to already being few in number. In the 1620s, only 40 frigates were active, and it seems that only 60 had been constructed by that point. Production was further slowed in the 1630s with the development of the double frigate. This type appears to be even more ambiguous, but seems to have been a frigate built for war, weighing between 200 to 400 tons and carrying 30 to 40 guns. Their speed and handling made a great impression on Spanish commanders, as did the skill of Flemish mariners. Their frigates were commanded to sail as far away as the Mediterranean, but they were entirely banned from the Americas. Possibly because the Spanish feared them falling into enemy hands, or because they did not want anyone but Spaniards, Castilians specifically, in the colonies, including their own Catholic subjects. This was likely to their own detriment. Flemish frigates would have made excellent pirate hunters at the buccaneering height of the 1660s, especially as the Spanish enemies came to adapt frigates for themselves. The design philosophy of the frigate eventually spread to Flanders' neighbours, and by 1670 it had become a favourite in England, France, and Holland. However, it didn't embody a single type of ship as much as an archetype. A frigate essentially meant any full-rigged ship built for speed, specifically, judging by the French definition, a hull built long and low. This reduced water resistance, making the ship cut through the water much more easily, and also facilitated better use of oars. However, 4 different types of frigates can be observed around this time period. These were the Frigate-Ships, Light Frigates, the Frigate-Built, and the Galley-Frigate. Let's start out with the Frigate-Ship. I took the name Frigate-Ship from a French classification between 1670 and 1730, defining frigates that either had 2 tiers of guns or 2 decks. They encompassed 4th and 5th rates, vessels of between 20 to 40 guns, too light for the line of battle but sufficient for other combat duties. The definition was virtually the same in England and Holland, where they were usually just called frigates. The frigate-ship arguably began as the double frigates invented by the Flemish, but they might have been copied from the Dutch adaptation around 1627. Built for speed, the Dutch frigate weighed 300 tons and carried 40 guns. Its mix of firepower and speed made it the mainstay of the Dutch fleet, finally allowing them to beat back the Flemish and win the North Sea. Herring for everyone. In the later decades, many of them can be seen on drawings by Willem van de Velde. These frigates saw great success in the Anglo-Dutch wars, but by then, the English buggers had adopted a frigate themselves. The English were the last of the big 4 to adopt a frigate, and its development history was shaky, to say the least. England had suffered greatly at the hands of the Flemish, who between 1625 and 1630 captured around 300 of England's ships. That was a fifth of her merchant fleet. The King's navy consisted of powerful but unhandy vessels, altogether unsuitable for chasing the nimble Flemings. As a response, the navy constructed 10-oared pinnaces of between 160 to 180 tons, called the Lion's Whelps. These met with some success, managing to capture a couple of frigates, but their performance deteriorated over time, possibly owing to their heavy superstructures and greater armament. Nonetheless, a frigate captured in 1635 was observed and copied. Its name was Swan, and it had a single deck, oars, and according to Captain Pennington, fast like a sprite. The replica vessels were named Greyhound and Roebuck, and although the designer called them pinnaces, the king himself called them frigates. They were not exact copies, seemingly being stronger and more seaworthy, and were sent for action against the Barbary corsairs. They weighed around 100 tons, and 2 vessels of similar design and over 300 tons were built shortly after for service in Barbary. Rated as pinnaces, their length-to-breadth ratio marked them as inspired by the frigates, and they were referred to as such in 1660. According to Samuel Pepys, a chief secretary to the Admiralty, the first English frigate was the Constant Warwick, constructed in 1642. Pepys wasn't exactly correct, but it points to the importance and quality of the Warwick. Inspired by a captured French frigate, it had been built by the piratical Earl of Warwick. I wonder who he named it after. We are fortunately blessed with an image of the Constant, drawn around 1685 by Willem van der Velde. Like the Dunkirkers, she was light and speedy, described as trembling in the sea, like the Turkish privateers do. By this point, civil war had just broken out between the King and Parliament of England, with most of the navy siding with Parliament, including Warwick, a Puritan. Charles I was forced to hire privateers to fill in the gaps at sea, many of them Dunkirk frigates. How the turns have tabled. Privateering was crucial in the conflict, as whomever could dominate the ocean could dominate commerce, and thus the invaluable support of the merchant classes. Parliament ordered the construction of new frigates in 45, including the 300-ton, 32-gun Adventure, Assurance, and Nonsuch. Lacking heavy superstructures, they did visually resemble the Dunkirkers, but they lacked any oars. These early frigates most likely resembled this ship model from 1660. Instead of becoming lighter, in accordance with the younger frigates, English frigates, just like me at the all-you-can-eat turtle buffet, became only heavier and heavier. When conflict broke out with the Dutch in 1652, frigates were expanded to have a second gun deck. The heaviest sort were the so-called Great Frigates, armed with as many as 74 guns. The enormous 1,522-ton, 102-gun Your Mom, no, I'm just kidding, I would never insult this fine ship in such a manner, Sovereign of the Seas, was even called a delicate frigate in 1651, after having her upper works reduced. Indeed, the word frigate had come to mean almost any man-of-war, and these great frigates were more so the ancestor of the ship of the line rather than any privateer or cruiser. Their only resemblance to their ancestor laying the length-to-breadth ratio, which, while initially constructed for speed, now played into the hands of modern tactics that would allow their evolution into line ships. Before the frigate, English naval tactics revolved around firing a broadside and then either escaping to reload or board the enemy. These maneuverable tactics were more difficult with the long and unhandy frigates, which were better suited for sailing together in a long line and peppering the enemy with continuous broadsides. You know, boom, 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 I want you in my gun room. And so, the line of battle was born. Even still, these vessels should be seen as part of an experimental phase. They had problems with strength, stability, and comfort, often being cramped. A recurring problem with frigates and big ships of all nations in the late 17th century was that they had a low freeboard, meaning that the lower gun deck was often filled with water. The designs were procedurally standardized, leading to a greater availability of ship plans from the period, and by the late 17th century, the frigate in France and England denoted a vessel smaller than a ship of the line and carrying between 20 to 40 guns. We'll look at specific designs later on. Now let's move on to the light frigate. A light frigate, or frégate légère, is another French definition, but judging by available descriptions, it definitely seems as if this ship type was likewise used by the pirates of England, even if they simply called it a frigate. The French were seemingly the first northern nation to adopt a frigate from the Flemish, with French frigates appearing in the mid-1620s. The English captured a French privateering frigate in 1628, implying that the type had been used for some years. Indeed, whilst the Dutch and English would take the route of heavier frigates, the French would refine its qualities as a privateer. In 1647, a French book named Les Coutumes de la Mer, the Customs of the Sea, described frigates as medium-sized privateering vessels, well armed, which are going by sail and oar. At another page, the book says, frigates, pinnaces, brigantines, pinks are privateering vessels, light and medium-sized, dovetails of the sea.
the tedious little turd who keeps putting on amusing voices. What else have you got in your astoundingly inventive repertoire, I wonder?
So by 1647, the frigate had become widespread among the French as a medium-sized, decently armed privateering vessel, propelled both by oar and sail. Around the same time, light frigates appear in the colonies, commanded by merchants and buccaneers of France and England. And more on this in a bit. Light frigates were first used by the French Navy in 1660, but only known as frigates. Frigate légère wasn't used as a definition until 1670, to distinguish these light frigates from the larger ship frigates, that is, 4th and 5th rates. We have preserved the specifications of a couple of these from between 1660 to 1670, and we'll take a look at them in just a bit. But for now, this definition from 1702 will suffice. A warship, a good sailboat, which has only one deck. It is ordinarily mounted from 16 to 25 pieces of cannon. Here comes the question if the light frigate descended from the Flemish vessels, or another type called the double shallop. The narrative goes that the double shallop, a large, long, undecked vessel, propelled by oars and armed with swivel guns, was eventually lengthened, had a deck added to it, and carriage guns, and more masts, creating the barque longue. By further increasing the size, adding a continuous flush deck, a raised aftercastle, and sometimes a forecastle, the light frigate was born. They carried between 8 to 16 guns, but got increasingly bigger as the century progressed, with the lightest eventually carrying 14, the heaviest 20. How exactly this narrative plays in with the Flemish design is uncertain. It is possible that both developments occurred simultaneously and that they were intertwined. A frigate was, after all, a somewhat broad definition. As long as it was built long and low, it could be called a frigate, whatever it descended from. We do have at least one image preserved of a frigate légère, dated to around 1672. It does not match the Navy's description from 2 years prior. The height of the ship makes it obvious that it has 2 decks, whereas the Frigate légère was supposed to have only 1. The gun ports are also of interest. Half of them open from forward like shutters, whereas the half astern open normally from above. As aforementioned, frigates started appearing in colonial pirate hands around 1640. To throw more oil on the flames, it is not certain if these descended from the Spanish frigata or the small frigates common with the Flemish and French. The answer could be both. Either way, they seem to have been virtually identical. Some were likely produced domestically in the colonies, and in the early days they were often confused for other types such as the pinnace or bark, seemingly because frigate appeared to first and foremost define a specific hull construction, a marked length-to-breadth ratio, and slimmer waist. They weren't only used for privateering, but trading also. In 1653, Captain Edward Hull captured a French frigate near Rhode Island, carrying a delectable cargo of wine, brandy, claret, and vinegar. The boys was gonna have a party or something. They undoubtedly resembled this later illustration of a small 10-gun frigate, equipped for trade and exploration in the Americas. This is probably what most light frigates looked like. We know that they were popular with Caribbean buccaneers, judging by statistics compiled by historians. Here's a list showing English privateers operating out of Jamaica and Tortuga in 1663. 6 of them are frigates. The largest carried 14 guns and 100 men, and was named Griffin. The smallest, unnamed, had only 4 guns and 40 men, meaning that a frigate could be quite small. This information corresponds to the details we have of French light frigates from between 1660 and 1670. The Griffin was likely similar to the 130-ton, 14-gun Adriatique, built in London in 1663 and purchased by the French in 65. The unnamed frigate was likely similar to the 30-ton, 6-gun Maureen, built in Dunkirk and commanded by the pirate Maureen le Bailleul. I wonder who the ship was named after. Maureen was captured in 1665 and hanged. Similar light frigates can also be found in the fleet of Henry Morgan, directed upon Panama in 1671. Only 4 of the 36 ships were called frigates. Firstly, we have the Satisfaction of 120 tons, 22 guns, and 140 men. Secondly, we have the Mary of 50 tons, 12 guns, and 70 men. Thirdly, we have the Dolphin of 60 tons, 10 guns, and 60 men. Lastly, the Lily of 50 tons, 10 guns, and 50 men. Let's take a quick look at the Satisfaction again. Her armament is very heavy for a 120-ton vessel when compared to the French light frigates. So many of the guns may have been swivels, light anti-personnel artillery mounted on the ship railings. This makes her comparable to the Sainte Anne, built in the Netherlands in 1653 and confiscated by the French crown in 61. She was of 120 tons, had a crew of 120 men, 12 carriage guns, and 12 swivels, totaling to 24 pieces. Whilst most of the light frigates would have looked like the image from before, the larger ones may actually have defied the definition from 1670 of only having a single deck. This image from around 1672 shows a large light frigate, which obviously has 2 decks, judging by her freeboard, the height between the railing and waterline. The armament of 26 guns, definitely very light pieces, 3 or 6 pounders, is what reduced her to a light frigate instead of a 5th rate or frigate vaisseau. She probably had a burden of around 200 tons, and is exemplary of the larger frigates used by pirates. In all likelihood, she would have been almost identical to the Oxford, the mighty flagship of Henry Morgan, at least for a couple of hours. The ship blew up in an accident while Morgan was having dinner, the same day that the ship was handed over to him. Having been sent directly from England, she had been constructed in 1656 and carried 26 guns. At this point, the English would probably have classified her as a 5th rate. The rating system in France and England were different, but I've also seen her called a 6th rate. Too weak to fight large merchants or to partake in the line of battle. They mostly performed escort work or joined squadrons in less demanding locations, like the Caribbean. These were most likely the style of the 6 frigates nimble, described in 1655 by Oliver Cromwell, whose raiding in Mexico would be enough to fund his Western design. Nonetheless, the Oxford was, at the time, probably the most powerful English ship in the Caribbean. A frigate-built is another term from the period which causes some confusion, even if it really shouldn't, since it essentially just meant the same as the French equivalent, frigate, to build a ship long and low. I'm not entirely sure why they used frigate-built instead of just frigate, but terminology in the period is confusing. When frigate would come to mean cruisers and privateers, frigate-built would denote merchant vessels built as previously said, but this wasn't the case in the 17th century, when both frigate and frigate-built could be used for any ship, whether privateer or trader. This is evident by the first appearance of frigate-built in 1676, in issue 1129 of the London Gazette, published on September 11. It described the arrival of a French privateer from Saint-Malo, called the Vin Orange, of 50 tons, 6 guns, and 53 men. On her stern she had painted an orange tree with a blue background. She had 3 masts and a white lion as a figurehead. Built in the Netherlands, she had been captured a few days prior by the Frenchmen. It isn't certain if she had previously been built for commerce or raiding, or both. Aside from giving us a very colorful insight into what a small ship in the period could have looked like, it is the first documented appearance of the term frigate-built. But sadly, it doesn't really tell us what this confusing term means. It is confusing because a later definition, albeit from 1757, says that a frigate-built meant a merchant vessel with a raised fore and after castle, compared to galley-built ships, which had a single, continuous weather deck from stem to stern. When it came about is uncertain, and it wasn't fully cemented in the late 18th century either, when frigate-built could also refer to small privateering or merchant vessels built for speed, much like the 17th century definition. As so far mentioned, frigates were also deployed as merchant vessels, and in the late 17th and early 18th century, it was common for merchant frigates to either be called Frigate-Built or have frigate as a suffix to their name. One such vessel was the Mocha frigate, constructed in 1694 by the East India Company for trade in the Orient. In 1697, her captain was taken out in his sleep, the mutinous crew turning to piracy. The ship would go on a pirate rampage across the Indian Ocean, finally ending her career in 1699. Of note is her engagement with the ship Dorrel. The merchants were quick to note how the pirates had cut down the galleries, that is, the balconies around the after castle, in order to improve speed. This was a sure sign of a pirate ship. The galleries had been replaced with large sally ports, in which were stowed big brass guns. The taffrail had also been taken down, and the frigate flew a Union Jack and a broad red pennant. The pirates fired shot of tin and pewter, but also assorted junk like broken porcelain, glass, and teapots. One man was wounded in the knee by a piece of chain. Merchants usually favored cargo capacity and a reduced crew, but the speed of the frigate proved an advantage too, as you could deliver shipments at a faster rate, and slip by pirates, blockades, and other troublesome folk. Another reason was if you had a perishable cargo, say a human cargo. Slave ships were very often frigates or frigate-built, as to deliver their shipment across the Atlantic before it expired. That is, perished from the conditions aboard. One such vessel was the frigate Onslow, owned by the Royal African Company in the early 18th century, and captured by Bartholomew Roberts in 1721. Roberts had the vessel further improved by pulling down the bulkheads, heavy internal partitions, and cutting down the upper works, making the frigate flush from stem to stern, and speedier as a result. This was his new flagship. Indeed, owing to their speed, slave ships made for excellent pirate vessels. An earlier example lies in the 500-ton Speaker. Initially built by the French and intended for war, she was 44 meters long and carried 40 guns. This impressive size and armament could nonetheless not save her, as she was captured by the English and used for trading slaves in the Indian Ocean. In 1700, she was captured by the Bermuda-born pirate John Bowen. According to prisoners kept on board by the pirates, she managed to capture a number of Dutch and Mughal vessels, before sinking in 1702, just off the island of Mauritius. She was discovered in 1979, and recovery has been ongoing ever since, with artifacts including an anchor, artillery, and baubles taken from the diverse cultures of Asia. These include an Ottoman coin, a Venetian coin, a bronze statue from southern India, glass trading beads, and Chinese porcelain. Since frigates were good for both slaving and privateering, their purpose often shifted depending on political circumstance. During the War of Spanish Succession, the French frigate La Concorde was used for corsairing in Africa and the Caribbean. When the war concluded, she was used for trading slaves. This is when she was captured by Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. I met him once, pleasant fellow, firm handshake. Pirates not only prized the ship for its qualities, but its valuable cargo. Though Blackbeard left most of the slaves with the French, he kept some as a labor force, possibly recruiting a couple into his crew, but eventually selling most of them in Carolina, an impoverished region especially starved for cheap labor. We're going to talk about the design of late 17th century and early 18th century frigates in a bit, but not before covering the final type, that being galley-frigates. After the 1670s, it becomes much easier to track the visual development of the frigate, owing to the increase in available illustrations and ship plans. These include the English galley-frigates, constructed throughout the 70s. The original frigate was specifically built to accommodate oars, but the English had largely abandoned them in favor of more firepower. A small number of them did still carry oars, like the fourth-rate Tiger. Armed with 46 cannons, the gun ports of her lower deck were pierced in between by a pair of scuttles, or oar ports. That is where you put the oars. Every oar had its designated oar port. According to instructions given to boatswains of galley frigates, each oar was to be marked with the same figure or letter of its respective oar port, so the crew would know where to put it. Each oar required at least 2 men, and they were to know which oar and oar port belonged to them. England squared off once more against the Barbary corsairs in the late 17th century, leading to the occupation of Tangier. For the defense of this newfound colony, the king ordered the construction of a number of galley frigates to counter the vessels of the corsairs. These were to combine the qualities of the earlier English frigates with the flexibility of rowing. Prime among them were the Charles Galley and James Galley, both of whom have been depicted in multiple paintings and illustrations by Willem van der Velde, along with detailed descriptions of their weights and dimensions. The James, while large, was still on the lower end and carried 30 guns, with her lower gun dedicated entirely to her oars, apart from what looks like a cheeky little gun port up here. The Charles Galley, named after the king himself, was definitely bigger and seemingly worthy of more images. Most prominently, this beautiful painting of the ship under sail, the oars withdrawn. As we can see, she appears much longer than regular ships as to better facilitate rowing, and her superstructures are much lower than the typical ship of the age. These images from her schematic shows the decorations of the ship, including the aftercastle with a royal coat of arms, the cabin gallery on the side, and finally the figurehead of a lion in the prow. This image shows her slightly from the side. Notice the lions on the inside of the gunport hatches. We also have a watercolor of the Charles, showing her operating the oars. Finally, we have another close-up sketch, this time showing her with the oars out in their full glory. The galleys and other frigates deployed in the Barbary Wars met with great success, much unlike the clumsier vessels deployed previously. In 1682, the commander of the fleet reported how they find it so hard to escape any of our frigates that once get a fair sight of them. The James and Charles were undoubtedly similar to the Adventure Galley, commanded by pirate captain Kidd. Constructed 20 years later, she was 6 meters longer than the average frigate and carried an armament of 34 light guns, similar to the James. The oars were carried on the lower gun deck. Though the Adventure did perform well enough in battle and seemed to have been quite speedy, she eventually had to be scuttled owing to a leaking problem. Galley frigates were likewise deployed as merchantmen. This image shows a Galley-Ship, very similar in length and shape to the Charles, so likely frigate-built, with the oars mounted between the gun ports. It was equipped both for trade and war in the Levant. In 1688, James II was deposed by Parliament and replaced by Mary Stuart and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, Stadtholder of the Netherlands. The Red and Orange had spent the last few decades under near constant conflict, in which most engagements were hard-fought slugging matches. Both ships and battles were big, even commerce warfare, such as the Holmes bonfire of 1666, when 150 Dutch merchantmen were destroyed. Even escort vessels tended to be small ships of the line, and there had been no need for specialized cruisers. A cruiser is essentially a light warship. But with this shift of allegiance, France became the new enemy. Though the French initially attempted the battle fleet strategy of her neighboring rivals, defeat at Barfleur and La Hogue in 1692 made them consider another option: light warships and commerce warfare. Their frigates would strike directly at Anglo-Dutch traders, and this philosophy would dominate French naval strategy for the coming 2 centuries. Not only did the French commission convoys of corsairs, they augmented these groupings with the regular naval forces. Instead of fighting in the shallows of the Netherlands, action had been moved to the stormy waters of Biscay, raising the need for vessels able to handle the rough weather. For the next 10 years, the English experimented heavily with new frigate designs, able to counter the French threat. One of the first pioneers was Lord Torrington, who constructed a series of innovative new frigates in 1689, often called the first real frigates, according to the later definition as a cruiser. A dictionary of nautical words and terms defines cruiser as a warship in which armor and armament are reduced to gain speed and sea endurance, so that it can be employed in search and scouting duties, but sufficiently armed and armored that it can take its place in a battle line. Torrington's new frigates placed a heavy emphasis on all-weather capabilities by raising the freeboard, improving habitability through clear, ventilated lower decks, and sailing qualities by setting the lower deck at the waterline. Like its ancestor, the frigate also had a high length-to-breadth ratio, but not as much as the Galley-Frigates. And though the Torrington frigates did carry Rs, they weren't as many, nor did they have a big crew. Rowing was an auxiliary function, not primary. With a tonnage of 360, these frigates were quite small, meaning that they could be constructed in large amounts. 30 were in service by 1693. They were classified as fifth rates, carrying 32 to 36 guns, usually 6 and 9 pounders. Lighter 6th-rate frigates were also constructed, usually carrying around 20 guns. It was all to no avail. The Anglo-Dutch alliance failed at running down the French corsairs and cornering them in their coastal bases. By the end of the war, the Admiralties considered the problem unsolved, and since a new war brewed on the horizon, new frigates were to be constructed. The Torrington frigates had suffered heavily in combat, and their armament was boosted to 40 guns. Most of their casualties had come from boarding combat, however, so the open waist of the ship, the midsection, was covered up by a slight deck, nowadays called a spar deck. This was essentially a wooden grating that didn't increase the weight of the ship significantly, while still letting the gun crews continue firing undisturbed. It also allowed them from below to shoot at the enemy climbing on the spar deck, and prevent the debris from falling down on them. Another defensive experiment was with spring-loaded explosives that could be set off from below to clear the upper deck. Nothing seems to have been especially effective, and the spar deck was eventually abandoned in the 1710s, when a greater emphasis was put on speed, including the removal of much of the upper works. A lot of inspiration in the frigate arms race was taken from captured French frigates. Their classification didn't really change between 1661 and to the mid and late 18th century, with frigates denoting 4th rates, also called frigates of the First Order, 5th rates or frigates of the Second Order, and the Light Frigates. A perfect example of a 4th rate is the Triton, built in 1697 and captured by the English in 1702. At 500 tons burthen, she carried 44 guns, most of them 12 and 6 pounders, with a crew of 250. She would likely have been similar to the Speaker, the frigate turned slaver turned pirate in the Indian Ocean. The larger tonnage went into the sleek hull form, which significantly improved the ship's speed. When the English took her, they copied the design in documents, along with a crude model called a solid. 6 years later, the French design was recycled into the Ludlow Castle. As seen on this model, she is virtually identical to the Triton, except in some details like a shorter aftercastle, the gallery removed, and a tonnage of 660 compared to 500. She was, however, smaller than the Triton. Owing to a shipwreck found near Saint-Malo, France, we have a good idea of what French privateering frigates looked like in the early 18th century, and by proxy, a lot of pirate ships and slavers, like the Queen Anne's Revenge. First of the wrecks was the Dauphin, a light frigate built in 1703 at Le Havre. At 180 tons, she was 33 meters long, 8.88 meters wide, and 3.74 meters tall. Her armament consisted of 22 8-pounders and 6 4-pounders, with a crew of 180. Quite large, but the French overcrowded their frigates to make them better at boarding. For the coming decades, the frigate would continue to see improvements in its standardized construction, speed, maneuverability, seaworthiness, and habitability. In 6 rates, a new emphasis was placed on rowing, with some having as many as 12 oar ports on each broadside. This was perfect for service in the Baltic Sea and the Americas, where they were deployed as pirate hunters. A perfect example is the HMS Greyhound, which defeated Edward Lowe in 1723, capturing his consort, Harris. Oars were instrumental in the engagement, as the wind died on multiple occasions. Oars would continue to be used on fighting vessels throughout the century, even if their usage fluctuated, depending on the circumstance. As the century progressed, the English became disappointed by the performance of their frigates. During the War of Jenkins' Ear, they were even outdone by the Spanish, with the ratio of merchants captured being 3-2 in favor of the Dons. In 1748, the decision was made once more to copy the homework of the French. By now, they had very much perfected the frigate design, a credit to a shipbuilder named Blaise Olivier. In 1741, he built the frigate Médée of 26 8-pounders, all of whom were carried on the upper deck. The lower deck was little more than a light platform with reduced headroom, and the deck positioned just below the waterline. This compressed the height of the topside, while the forecastle and quarterdeck were unarmed and had no barricades or rails to catch the wind and slow the ship down. Together with the fine lines and light framing, the frigate was both fast and weatherly. This design would soon be adopted by all major European navies, and historians have since called it the true frigate, and it would persist for the rest of the period. The design was adapted to larger frigates, with the French once more taking the lead in 1748, constructing two-decked 12-pounder frigates, named after their primary armament. They usually measured at between 800 to 900 tons, and could carry up to 44 guns. Heavy frigates were becoming increasingly common in the conflicts of the late 18th century, including the American Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, to such an extent that the smaller frigates became increasingly phased out. The common kind in the late century was a long and low vessel, carrying 36 to 38 18-pounder guns. Mobility wasn't only owed to their sleek construction, but the capacity to carry 6 months' worth of provisions, allowing them to sail anywhere in the world without having to make port. This made them excellent for commerce raiding, pirate and privateer hunting, and reconnaissance. In 1792, Nelson remarked, "Frigates! Were I to die this moment, want of frigates would be found engraved on my heart." That's a bit dramatic, dude. His fleet, though powerful, lacked eyes and ears in the form of frigates, allowing Napoleon to slip him by and invade Egypt. Un petit de trop lâche. Aside from independent operations, frigates served in fleet action by assisting disabled ships and taking possession of captured enemies. It was common etiquette not to fire upon frigates unless if they fired first. So in engagements like Trafalgar, frigates like the Eurelius went entirely unscathed, even as she towed a dismasted royal sovereign out of danger. Even if cornered, frigates could take a significant beating. Oak was the main building material, safe against bullets, but not against cannonballs. This created horrible splinters that could kill or wound a crew, but oak splinters usually produced a clean wound, whereas splinters from teak, for example, would usually go septic. Masts were usually made of pine, often from entire trunks. Whilst the frigate of the late 18th century denoted a well-armed cruiser, the very small, full-rigged frigates of the 17th century survived in different forms, though they went by different names. Those small kinds of pirate frigates, carrying around 10 guns, had more or less been reborn as the corvette, a sort of mini-frigate. Pioneered by the French, as usual, they were a mainstay on both sides of the American Revolution. The King George was a 12-gun corvette operating under British letter of marque, captained by a Rhode Island loyalist named Stanton Hazard. Preying on rebel shipping, she was eventually taken by the sloop Revenge, operating as a U.S. privateer, before being taken by the Navy and reclassified into the HMS Allegiance, a ship sloop of 14 guns. She was then captured by the French, and then again by the British. Phew! Another privateer corvette was the Mohawk of 1781. Of 250 tons, she carried 20 guns. She went on a cruise to the West Indies before returning home, where she was taken by the British and reclassified into a sloop. In the Royal Navy, sloop at this point basically meant anything lighter than a 6-rate. Another large corvette was the 16-gun General Pickering, large enough to be used both as a privateer and a merchant vessel. On her first cruise, she delivered sugar and molasses to a Spanish port, but saw most of her success as a privateer, managing to capture 40 prizes. That's impressive. She managed to beat the British privateers Golden Eagle and Achilles off Bilbao in 1780, but the next year she was impounded on a Caribbean island. Experiments were likewise made with large frigates, known as heavy frigates, and sometimes as super frigates. They carried more cannons, usually around 44, with many of them being very heavy 24-pounders. The French took several ships of the line and reseed them. That is, they cut down most of the upper decks until they had created a much lower vessel, a heavy frigate. A number of heavy frigates were likewise constructed by the United States to serve in conflicts like the Barbary Wars and the War of 1812. One of the developments in the early 19th century frigates is the rounded bow and stern. These parts of the ship were the weakest and susceptible to raking, firing a cannonball that would go straight through the entire ship, wiping out anything in its path. A rounded stern would be able to deflect bullets more easily. The last of the 19th century frigates were long, rounded, and flat. By the middle of the century, the frigate as a warship was phased out by steamships. At the end of the frigate age, the vessel nonetheless survived as a merchant vessel, and trading frigates persisted into the early 20th century. Of special note are the Blackwall frigates, constructed in the 1830s and 40s. Named after the Blackwall yard in which they were constructed, they were built as a speedier alternative to the East Indiamen, conducting trade between England and the Orient. New developments in naval architecture allowed 19th century ships to be built considerably long, though this was nothing unique to the Blackwall frigates. Their shape was compared to serving mullets, and they had a less pronounced tumble home than earlier East Indiamen. These were large vessels, of between 800 to 1,400 tons burthen. They were not especially fast when sailing with the wind, but off-wind they could reach incredible speeds. In 1689, the Blackwall frigate Norfolk made it from England to Melbourne, Australia, in just 70 days. Even in the dawning age of steam, the merchant frigate was being supplanted by a brand new type of sail ship, the last great type of the Age of Sail, the Clipper. Originating from the United States, with the first one launched being the Rainbow of 1845, Clippers were large, absurdly long vessels with 3 or 4 masts loaded with sails. Along with smaller vessels, they would dominate the final days of sail, as they were increasingly supplanted by more cost-effective engines in the early 20th century. The frigate survived as a steamship type from the mid to late 19th century. In the 20th century and today, the term has been used, here and there, in reference to different types of ships used for various purposes, including submarine countering, missile guiding, or coastal combat. Aside from the name, they have little in common with their ancestor, seemingly apart from the need for speed. That is the story of the frigate. Cheers, me hearty. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hype the video, that is like a new function that's on here. Donate money if you got it. Become a Patreon supporter. Whatever. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.